October 25, 1942. The rain hammered down on Guadalcanal like it had a personal vendetta against every Marine dug into that muddy ridge. Sergeant Mitchell Page crouched in the darkness, rain streaming off his helmet, hands working methodically to string tripwire in front of his machine gun positions. He wasn't some grizzled 20-year veteran. The guy was only 24 years old. But he'd been a machine gunner for 6 years, which in 1942 made him practically an expert. And on this particular night, that expertise was about to be tested in ways that would seem impossible if they weren't documented history. Page commanded a machine gun platoon, 33 Marines total, positioned on a ridge roughly 4 miles west of Henderson Field, the most valuable piece of real estate in the South Pacific. That airstrip wasn't just some patch of dirt. It was the reason everyone was here, bleeding and dying in this steaming jungle. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air corridor between the United States and Australia. The Japanese knew it, the Marines knew it, and both sides were willing to stack bodies like cordwood to either take it or keep it. The Marines had seized the nearly completed airfield back on August 7th, catching the Japanese completely off guard. They renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway just 2 months earlier. But that initial success turned into a grinding nightmare when the U.S. Navy, after getting mauled in the Battle of Savo Island, hauled anchor and left. The Marines found themselves stranded with less than half their supplies unloaded, facing an enemy that was rushing reinforcements to the island by the thousands. For 2.5 months, it had been absolute hell. The Japanese attacked. The Marines held. Repeat until everyone's sick, exhausted, and running on spite and coffee. Well, when they had coffee. Most of the time, they were eating captured Japanese rice and trying not to think about the malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections that were eating them alive, almost as effectively as enemy bullets. Now, in late October, intelligence indicated something big was coming. Not just another probing attack or a company-sized assault. The entire Japanese 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, was massing in the jungle for one final desperate push to retake the airfield. Intercepted maps showed attacks coming from 3 directions simultaneously. This was it, the knockout punch. Page's platoon from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines had force-marched to this position just hours earlier. They were assigned to defend a ridge that ran roughly east-west, with Company E on the lower western hill, Company G in the saddle, and Company F on the higher eastern hill. Page's machine gun section was spread across this line with 4 Browning M19-17A1 water-cooled 30 caliber machine guns. These weren't the lighter air-cooled M1919s you might be thinking of. The M1917A1 weighed 93 pounds without water or ammunition. With the tripod, water jacket filled, and ammo, you're looking at well over 100 pounds of American-made death. But here's what made them valuable. They could fire continuously, pour water in that jacket, keep feeding belts, and these guns would hammer out 450, 600 rounds per minute for hours, if necessary. That sustained fire capability had already saved Marine positions at the Tenaroo River in August and during Edson's Ridge in September. The Japanese had learned the hard way that charging American machine gun positions resulted in carpets of their own dead. As Page finished rigging his makeshift early warning system, see ration cans on tripwire with empty cartridges inside to rattle, he could hear something out in the jungle darkness. Movement, lots of it. The sound of equipment, the low murmur of voices speaking Japanese. They were out there, massing somewhere in those ravines south of the ridge. How many? Hundreds? Thousands? In the darkness and rain, it was impossible to tell, but Page knew enough to understand that when dawn broke, this ridge was either going to be held by Marines or overrun by the Imperial Japanese Army. There wasn't going to be a middle ground. The attack began at exactly 2 a.m. on October 26th, not with a subtle probe or a reconnaissance element testing the line. No, the Japanese came in with everything they had. A full-scale assault by elements of the 16th and 29th Infantry Divisions, roughly 2,500 men, all aimed directly at the sector Page's platoon, was defending. The relative quiet of the jungle night shattered into absolute chaos in seconds. Page heard his tripwire system rattle first. Those C-ration cans with their empty cartridges made exactly the noise he'd hoped for, audible even over the rain. Then he heard boots, hundreds of boots, splashing through mud and crushing vegetation. The Japanese weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were screaming, "Tenoheika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" at the top of their lungs. This wasn't infiltration tactics. This was a human wave, designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers and ferocity. Page scrambled along his line, moving from gun position to gun position, alerting his Marines. Every machine gun crew consisted of a gunner, an assistant gunner, and several ammunition bearers. In theory, these teams had trained together, knew their weapons, and could maintain fire indefinitely. In practice, they were about to face something that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. When the Japanese assault force closed to about 300 yards, Page gave the order to open fire. All four M1917A1s opened up simultaneously, their distinctive hammering sound cutting through the rain and screams. Tracers arced out into the darkness, revealing, just for a moment, exactly how many men were charging their position. It was terrifying. The Japanese weren't advancing in neat lines like some parade ground exercise. They were swarming up that ridge like a human flood, bayonets fixed on their Arisaka rifles, officers waving swords, everyone screaming. The Marines poured fire into them. Belt after belt of 30-06 ammunition cycled through those machine guns, the water in the cooling jackets turning hot despite the rain. Japanese soldiers fell in rows, but more kept coming. That's the thing about Banzai charges that Hollywood never quite captures correctly. They weren't stupid. They were doctrinally sound attacks based on Japanese military philosophy that emphasized spirit, aggression, and the willingness to die for the Emperor. The Japanese High Command believed that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. And when you're defending a position in the dark against hundreds of screaming men who genuinely believe death in battle is the highest honor, that philosophy becomes absolutely horrifying to face. The Japanese also had artillery support. Howitzers positioned west of the Matanikau River were dropping shells on the Marine positions, trying to suppress the machine guns. Mortar rounds were walking up and down the ridge. Page and his Marines were taking fire from multiple directions, the charging infantry to their front, indirect fire from behind Japanese lines, and now Japanese soldiers who'd infiltrated around the flanks were shooting at them from the sides. Company F, positioned on the higher hill to the east, was getting hit especially hard. The Japanese were exploiting gaps between the American positions, doing exactly what good infantry does, finding the seams in the defense and pouring through them. Page could hear the intensity of fire from that sector increasing, which meant his neighboring Marines were in serious trouble. His own gunners were performing magnificently under pressure. The M1917A1s kept firing, barrels glowing dull red in the darkness, despite the water cooling. Ammunition bearers were running belts forward, keeping the guns fed. The assistant gunners were spotting targets and managing the ammunition flow. This was the Marine Corps machine gun section, operating exactly as designed, a coordinated team delivering overwhelming firepower to break up infantry assaults. But the Japanese kept coming. First wave repelled, second wave charging through the bodies of the first. Page knew the mathematics of this fight, and they weren't encouraging. His platoon had maybe 15,000 rounds of linked ammunition total. The Japanese had 2,500 men. Even if every bullet found its mark, which never happens in combat, that's only 6 rounds per attacker. And not every bullet hits, not even close. Around 3 a.m. things started falling apart. The Japanese had been attacking for an hour straight, and Page's Marines were beginning to take casualties. Not from bad luck or poor positioning, They were simply in a fight where the enemy had numerical superiority and was willing to trade lives at a rate that would make any sane commander weep. The first machine gun position went silent when a Japanese grenade landed directly in the emplacement. 1 second it was hammering out fire, the next it was just quiet. Page watched his gunner and assistant gunner get blown apart. The ammunition bearers for that position were hit seconds later by rifle fire from Japanese soldiers who'd gotten close enough to pick out targets in the muzzle flash. That's 4 Marines down, 1 gun out of action. Page grabbed 2 Marines from a nearby rifle position and rushed them over to get that gun back in operation. In a night fight, you can't afford to have gaps in your line. Gaps get exploited. Gaps get people killed. They got the M1917A1 back up and running, but the 2 Marines he'd just positioned there lasted maybe 15 minutes before a Japanese infiltrator got close enough to empty a rifle magazine into them from point-blank range. This is what made night fighting in the Pacific so nightmarish. It wasn't like daytime combat where you could see threats developing and engage them at distance. At night, especially in rain, your effective visual range was maybe 20 or 30 feet. The Japanese were experts at infiltration, crawling forward through vegetation, using the terrain, getting right up to your position before you even knew they were there. Then it was knives, bayonets, and grenades at ranges where training matters less than pure violent reaction. Gun position 2 went down when Japanese mortar fire scored a direct hit. The explosion killed the entire crew instantly and damaged the weapon itself. That's another 6 Marines gone. Page was now down to 2 functioning guns out of 4, and the Japanese were still coming in waves. He moved between the remaining positions, directing fire, helping reload, trying to maintain some coherent defense. His gunner at position 3 took a bullet through the chest and slumped over his weapon. Page pushed him aside, no time for sentiment, no time for anything except keeping that gun firing, and took over. He burned through 2 belts before a Japanese soldier came screaming out of the darkness with a bayonet. Page shot him off the gun with his .45 pistol, then went back to the M1917A1. The assistant gunner at that position was hit next, then the ammunition bearers. One by one, Page watched his Marines get cut down. Some died instantly. Others were wounded and crawled or stumbled to the rear, looking for the battalion aid station. The noise was unbelievable, screaming in Japanese and English, machine gun fire, rifle fire, grenades exploding, men dying in ways that would haunt the survivors for decades. By 4 a.m., Page realized something that would have broken most men. He was alone. All 33 Marines in his platoon were either dead or wounded badly enough that they'd pulled back. He was the last man standing on that ridge with 4 machine gun positions to defend. 4 guns, all of them now silent, except for whichever one he was currently operating. The Japanese sensed the weakening resistance and pressed harder. They'd already overrun Company F's position on the higher hill. The Marines there had been pushed back, leaving a massive gap in the American line. If the Japanese exploited that gap and swung behind Page's position, Henderson Field was gone. The battle for Guadalcanal was over. The entire Solomon Islands campaign fails. The strategic balance in the Pacific potentially shifts back toward Japan, and the only thing standing between that outcome and American victory was one 24-year-old Serbian immigrant from Pennsylvania who'd enlisted in the Marines 6 years earlier because his mother told him stories about warriors defending their homeland. Page made a decision that seems insane until you understand the Marine Corps. He didn't retreat. He didn't pull back to reform with other units. He stayed on that ridge, and he fought. Here's what makes Page's stand so remarkable from a purely mechanical standpoint. The Browning M1917A1 was not designed for solo operation. It was a crew-served weapon for very specific reasons related to how machine guns actually function under sustained fire conditions. The M1917A1 fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge at approximately 450-600 rounds per minute, depending on adjustment. It used a recoil-operated water-cooled system that required constant attention. That water jacket surrounding the barrel wasn't just for show. Sustained fire generates enough heat to warp and potentially melt an air-cooled barrel. The water absorbed that heat, turning to steam that vented through a tube. In combat conditions, that water needed refreshing every few hundred rounds, or the system overheated anyway. The ammunition came in 250-round canvas belts. Each belt weighed roughly 15 pounds. The weapon fired so fast that a 250-round belt lasted about 30 seconds of continuous fire. That means every 30 seconds, Page needed to reload. Reloading wasn't just slapping in a magazine. He had to lift the feed cover, position the new belt, pull the first few rounds through the feed mechanism, close the cover, and charge the weapon, under fire, in the dark, while Japanese soldiers were actively trying to kill him. Page operated in a pattern that would have been impossible for someone without his 6 years of machine gun experience. He'd fire from one position until the gun ran through its ready ammunition, or until Japanese forces concentrated fire on his muzzle flash. Then he'd drop down, low crawl through the mud to the next gun position, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, while bullets snapped through the air above him. He'd pop up at the new position and open fire from a different angle, forcing the attackers to readjust their assault. The Japanese kept coming in waves. After each assault was repelled, there'd be a brief lull, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, where Page could hear the Japanese officers rallying their men for another charge. He used those precious moments to reload guns, check water levels, and prepare for the next wave. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training. Feed the belt, charge the weapon, acquire target, fire. The repetition became almost mechanical, a grim rhythm that kept him alive. The physical toll was extraordinary. Each time Page moved between positions, he was carrying belts of ammunition with him, anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds of extra weight. He'd already been awake for nearly 24 hours. He was soaking wet from rain and sweat. His uniform was caked with mud. His hands were burned from touching hot metal. And he was operating in that heightened state of combat awareness where every shadow might be an enemy, every sound might be someone trying to kill you. The M1917A1's water-cooled system actually gave Page a crucial advantage. Air-cooled light machine guns like the M1919 had to be fired in controlled bursts to prevent overheating, usually 6 to 9 round bursts with pauses between. But Page could hold the trigger down and sweep entire killing zones with continuous fire. When a wave of Japanese infantry charged across open ground toward his position, he could traverse the gun left to right in one long, sustained burst that cut through them like a scythe through wheat. The Japanese tried multiple tactics to neutralize him. They concentrated rifle fire on his positions, forcing him to move. They tried to suppress him with their own machine guns, Type 92 heavy machine guns, nicknamed woodpeckers by Marines because of their distinctive slower rate of fire. They even attempted infiltration, sending individual soldiers crawling through the darkness to get close enough for grenade throws or bayonet attacks. But Page kept moving, kept firing, kept fighting. Gun position 1, run through the belt, move. Gun position 3, reload, fire, move again. Gun position 4, the barrel's getting too hot even with water cooling. Switch to gun position 2, keep firing. Let's break down the impossible math of what Page was doing, because the numbers alone tell a story that sounds like fiction. A properly crewed M1917A1 machine gun section operated with 4 men minimum, gunner, assistant gunner, and 2 ammunition bearers. The gunner fired the weapon. The assistant gunner fed belts, spotted targets, and managed barrel changes. The ammunition bearers kept a steady supply of belts coming forward from reserve stocks. This division of labor existed because the physical and mental demands of sustained machine gun fire exceeded what one person could reasonably handle. Page was doing the job of 4 men, multiplied by 4 gun positions. That's effectively 16 roles being performed by one person. And he wasn't doing it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. He maintained this for approximately 4 hours straight, from 2 a.m. when the attack began until roughly 6 a.m. when reinforcements finally arrived. 4 hours of sustained combat at multiple machine gun positions. Let's do the math. If Page was averaging one 250-round belt every 2 minutes across his 4 guns, which is actually a conservative estimate given the intensity of the fighting, that's 30 belts per hour. Over 4 hours, that's 120 belts. At 250 rounds per belt, Page fired approximately 30,000 rounds of .30 06 ammunition. 30,000. The entire ammunition load his platoon had brought to the position. Each belt weighed 15 pounds. Page physically moved and loaded 1,800 pounds of ammunition while simultaneously operating the guns. That's not counting the times he had to crawl between positions carrying extra belts with him. An Olympic athlete in perfect conditions would struggle with that physical output. Page was doing it in combat, exhausted, under fire, in the rain, in the dark. The water cooling system added another layer of complexity. Each M1917A1 held about 2 quarts of water in its jacket. Under sustained fire, that water boiled off as steam. Page had to monitor 4 separate cooling systems and refill them when possible. In the jungle rain, he could collect water in his helmet and pour it into the fill spout. But doing that meant stopping fire, exposing himself to enemy observation, and hoping the Japanese didn't rush his position during those vulnerable seconds. Barrel changes presented the worst problem. Even with water cooling, barrels could overheat after sustained fire, maybe 1,000 to 1,500 rounds depending on conditions. A hot barrel affected accuracy and could potentially cause a malfunction or even a catastrophic failure. The standard procedure required removing the barrel with an asbestos glove because touching it barehanded meant third-degree burns, installing a cool replacement barrel, and getting back into action. This was normally a 2-man job requiring about 30 seconds. Page was doing it alone while Japanese soldiers were charging his position. The mental calculation happening simultaneously was equally staggering. Page wasn't just blindly firing into the darkness. He was making constant tactical decisions. Which gun position offers the best field of fire for this particular wave? Where is my ammunition getting low? Which approach are the Japanese using for this assault? Is that shadow at 50 feet a bush or an enemy soldier? When do I displace to another position to avoid counter-fire? Combat researchers have documented that soldiers under this level of stress experience time distortion and sensory narrowing. Some of Page's later interviews mentioned this phenomenon, moments where everything seemed to slow down, where he could see individual details with crystal clarity, followed by periods where hours compressed into what felt like minutes. His brain was operating on pure adrenaline and training, processing information faster than conscious thought. The human body wasn't designed for this. Your cardiovascular system, under this much stress, dumps massive amounts of adrenaline and cortisol into your bloodstream. Heart rate spikes to 175-200 beats per minute. Fine motor skills deteriorate. Tunnel vision sets in. Most people would physically collapse from exhaustion within an hour. But Page's 6 years as a machine gunner gave him something most people didn't have: unconscious competence. His hands knew these weapons so intimately that he could load, fire, and clear malfunctions in complete darkness by feel alone. That expertise was the only reason the math worked. Around 5:30 a.m., the darkness began giving way to that gray pre-dawn light that comes before sunrise in the tropics. For the first time in nearly 4 hours, Page could actually see what he'd been fighting against. The sight would have broken lesser men. The ridge in front of his positions was covered with Japanese dead. Not a dozen, not 50. Hundreds of bodies lay sprawled across the muddy slope, stacked in some places 2 and 3 deep, where they'd fallen on top of each other during successive waves. The grass was trampled flat, torn up by boots and bullets and grenades. Blood mixed with rainwater, turning the ground into a red-brown slurry that looked like something from a nightmare. But the Japanese weren't done. Even as dawn broke, another wave formed up in the ravine below. Page could see them clearly now, exhausted, depleted, but still coming. Officers with swords pointed up the ridge. The soldiers fixed bayonets and started another charge, screaming their war cries even though their voices were hoarse from hours of fighting. Page was on his last reserves of everything: ammunition, energy, sanity. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. He'd moved to gun position 4 and was preparing to fire when he heard something behind him. American voices. He spun around, .45 pistol in hand, and saw the most beautiful sight of his life: reinforcements. Major Odell Connolly had scraped together a scratch force of 17 men, supply personnel, communications Marines, cooks, anyone who could hold a rifle. Behind them came 2 platoons from the 5th Marines who'd been rushed to plug the gap. They weren't many, but they were enough. Page made a decision that defines the difference between surviving combat and winning it. He could have pulled back, let the fresh troops take over, collapsed in exhausted relief. Instead, he ran to Company G's position and commandeered one of their machine guns. He ordered several riflemen to fix bayonets and follow him. They looked at this mud-covered, wild-eyed sergeant who'd just fought off hundreds of Japanese alone, and they followed without question. Page cradled that M1917A1, still on its tripod, ripped right off its mount, and charged back toward the lost ground. Not fired from a prone position, not set up in a defensive emplacement. He carried the 93-pound weapon, with 2 other Marines hauling ammunition belts beside him, and advanced directly into the Japanese assault. This is the part that gets questioned in historical accounts because it seems physically impossible, but multiple witnesses confirmed it. Page fired the M1917A1 from the hip as he advanced, sweeping it across the Japanese line. The recoil on these weapons was manageable because of the gun's weight and the water cooling system's mass. It wasn't accurate fire. You can't aim a machine gun from the hip with any precision, but accuracy didn't matter when the target was a mass of enemy infantry packed together on a ridge. The psychological effect was devastating. The Japanese had been attacking American positions all night. Now an American was attacking them with a machine gun, leading a bayonet charge. It broke something in their momentum. The fresh Marines surged forward with Page, rifles firing, bayonets leveled. The hand-to-hand fighting lasted maybe 3 minutes of absolute chaos. Bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, anything that could be used as a weapon. The Marines retook the lost positions on the higher hill, driving the Japanese back down into the ravine. By 6 a.m., it was over. The Japanese 17th Army's final assault on Henderson Field had failed. The ridge was back in American hands. Page stood among the positions he'd defended alone for 4 hours, finally able to stop moving, stop fighting, stop being the only thing between the Japanese and Henderson Field. 3 other Marines had brought ammunition to him during that final charge. All 3 were wounded, but survived. That detail matters because it shows Page wasn't some invincible superhero. He was a Marine who inspired other Marines to do impossible things. When full daylight came, the Marine commanders ordered a body count, not out of morbid curiosity, but because accurate casualty assessment was essential for understanding what they'd just survived and what might come next. The official count in front of Page's positions and the immediately surrounding sectors came to over 1,100 Japanese dead. When combined with casualties from the simultaneous attacks on other parts of the perimeter during the battle for Henderson Field, fought from October 23rd to 26th, the total Japanese losses exceeded 2,200 killed. Some estimates pushed it closer to 3,500 when including wounded who died later in the jungle. For context, that's roughly the equivalent of an entire regiment wiped out in 3 days. The Marines walked through the aftermath with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Japanese bodies lay in rows where machine gun fire had caught them in the open. Some clutched photographs of families they'd never see again. Others still gripped their Arisaka rifles with bayonets fixed. The scene drove home a brutal reality about Pacific War combat that would repeat on island after island. The Japanese fought with a level of determination that made every piece of ground cost blood, measured in gallons. Page's defensive sector told its own story: 4 machine gun positions, each surrounded by spent brass casings that glittered in the morning sun like fool's gold. The M1917A1s were scorched, barrels discolored from heat, water jackets empty. The positions themselves were cratered from mortar fire and littered with Japanese equipment: helmets, packs, weapons, ammunition pouches. Everything abandoned by men who'd charged forward knowing they probably wouldn't come back. The cost to the Marines had been severe too. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 7th Marines suffered heavy casualties during the 3-day battle. Page's platoon of 33 men had been effectively destroyed, killed or wounded, to the point where the unit ceased to exist as a functional element. Company F, which held the higher hill, had been mauled. The 105th Infantry Regiment, fighting in other sectors, would later face an even bloodier Banzai charge on Saipan in 1944 that would kill or wound nearly 1,000 American soldiers. But Henderson Field remained in American hands. That's what mattered strategically. The airfield that the Japanese had started building in July, that the Marines had captured in August, that both sides had bled for continuously, since it stayed American. And with it came control of the air corridor between the United States and Australia. The battle for Henderson Field marked the end of major Japanese offensive operations on Guadalcanal. Lieutenant General Hayaku Take's 17th Army had thrown everything it had at the Marines and failed. The numerical superiority that had worked so well for Japan in 1941 and early 1942, when they'd conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and swept across the Pacific, stopped working the moment they ran into prepared American defenses anchored by weapons like the M1917A1. Over the next few months, the Japanese situation on Guadalcanal deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. Supply lines couldn't keep up. American air and naval power grew stronger. Japanese soldiers began starving in the jungle, dying from disease and malnutrition in numbers that sometimes exceeded combat losses. By February 1943, Tokyo made the painful decision to evacuate the island entirely. They called it a strategic withdrawal. Everyone knew what it really was: defeat. The Guadalcanal campaign became the strategic turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan advanced. After Guadalcanal, Japan retreated. The Marines and Army troops who fought there, sick, undersupplied, outnumbered at various points, proved that Japanese forces could be beaten in sustained ground combat. They shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had grown since Pearl Harbor. And on that particular ridge on October 26, one Serbian immigrant from Pennsylvania had held the line when holding seemed impossible. Mihajlo Pejic was born in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, in 1918 to Serbian immigrants from Herzegovina. His mother kept him connected to his ethnic roots, telling him stories about the Battle of Kosovo and Serbian warriors who defended their homeland against impossible odds. But she also raised him as a proud American, teaching him that his loyalty belonged to the country that had given his family opportunity. When he anglicized his name to Mitchell Page and enlisted in the Marine Corps at age 18 in September 1936, he was doing what immigrant sons had done for generations, proving their American identity through military service. Page had spent 6 years as a machine gunner before Guadalcanal. He'd served in the Philippines, in China, during the tense years before Pearl Harbor, and at various stateside posts. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't from a famous military family. He was a working-class kid who'd found his calling in the Marine Corps and gotten exceptionally good at one specific job, operating the Browning M1917A1. On May 21, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt presented Page with the Medal of Honor. The citation read in part, "When the enemy broke through the line directly in front of his position, Platoon Sergeant Page, commanding a machine gun section with fearless determination, continued to direct the fire of his gunners until all his men were either killed or wounded. Alone, against the deadly hail of Japanese shells, he manned his gun, and when it was destroyed, took over another, moving from gun to gun, never ceasing his withering fire against the advancing hordes until reinforcements finally arrived. 2 other Marines received the Medal of Honor for actions during the battle for Henderson Field. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone held a different sector on October 24, 25, performing similar heroics with his machine guns. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien led his battalion until he was killed in action. All 3 men exemplified the kind of individual courage that became synonymous with Pacific War combat. But Page's stand had implications beyond individual heroism. It validated American defensive doctrine in jungle warfare. The combination of properly positioned machine guns, interlocking fields of fire, and Marines trained to hold their positions against Banzai charges became the template for island fighting throughout the Pacific. At Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, American forces would face similar suicidal attacks. The tactics developed and proven on Guadalcanal, let them come, break them with sustained fire, counterattack to retake lost ground, worked repeatedly. The M1917A1 itself became legendary among Pacific War veterans. While it was eventually supplemented and replaced by lighter, more portable weapons, that water-cooled Browning remained the gold standard for defensive firepower. Marines who'd fought on Guadalcanal specifically requested M1917A1s for later campaigns because they'd seen what those guns could do. Page survived the war, married, and lived quietly for decades. He died in 2003 at age 85 in La Quinta, California. By then, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. His funeral drew Marines from multiple generations who understood what his stand on that ridge had meant, not just for the battle, but for every Marine who came after him. The Serbian immigrant's mother had told him stories about warriors defending their homeland. On October 26, 1942, Page lived that story on a muddy ridge in the Solomon Islands, defending adopted soil with a level of courage that transcended nationality or ethnicity. He was simply a Marine, doing an impossible job, refusing to quit when quitting would have been entirely understandable. Guadalcanal taught the American military that the Pacific War would be won by exactly these kinds of men, trained, determined, willing to hold ground no matter the cost. Mitchell Page's 14 hours manning those machine guns became the standard against which all subsequent defensive stands were measured. Not because what he did was replicable, it wasn't, but because it showed what was possible when training, courage, and desperation merged at a critical moment in history.